right, so here we go. So global energy, the challenges. Many thanks to our sponsors, the Bristol Energy Cooperative. And these are figures that perhaps a lot of you aren't particularly familiar with. I'm sure it'll come as no surprise that oil is our major primary fuel. And actually, maybe what I should do first is explain what a primary fuel is. That's the resource that we get out of the ground, or the primary material that we use before it's converted into something that's more useful to us. So, for example, oil, of course, isn't of much use. We refine it so that we can use it as petroleum or diesel. Gas, we do use neat. We process it to make it usable for cooking or heating. But, of course, we also use it, we burn it to turn steam turbines and convert it into electricity. Coal, these days in our countries, of course, we don't use coal directly as a heat source. We use it mainly for electricity, but that's not true in many parts of the world, as we'll see. So these are our primary fuels, and these are measured in million tonnes of oil equivalent, so that you can directly compare them. And if anybody thinks, of course, that as anybody's been reading Matt Ridley, you'll have read the story that fossil fuels have been so great for us, which is true. They have absolutely transformed our society. They have become cheap for us. They're very accessible. They've absolutely changed our world in the last 250 years. But of course, that isn't true for a large part of the world. Quite shockingly, I think, a 2012 World Bank report revealed that 2.5 billion, and when you think our world population is still only about 7.3 billion, they still rely on solid wood, charcoal, straw and dung as their primary fuel source. And that the vast majority, many people still rely on kerosene, which one kerosene lamp, when you think about it, is the equivalent of smoking a couple of packs of cigarettes per day. So it's dirty, it's expensive, and it's dangerous. Fossil fuels also haven't contributed to the wealth of many countries. Remember that they have to, like all commodities, they have to be bought in dollars. And so they are a major cause of indebtedness. These days, no country gets off the ground in terms of development until they access fossil fuels, particularly oil for transport. And even if they're an oil producer themselves, they have to send it abroad generally for refining and then buy it back in dollars. So developing countries are dependent not just on the commodity markets, but they're also dependent on the foreign exchange markets and whether the dollar is up and down, or up or down. And this is what is keeping our energy companies, our fossil fuel energy companies, so happy at the moment, of course, is that so many people do not have access to energy and that there's so much room for growth. At the moment, in fact, we have a 3-speed growth in the world. Our industrialised economies, the OECD countries, pretty much are going down, in fact, in our energy demand. But although there's a story behind that, but and China, the second stage, has had this enormous amount of growth, but has now flattened off. And so the big hope really is in the emerging markets, and that they will, that their demand will take off. And this is what's keeping our fossil fuel energies companies extremely buoyant at the moment. If you look at it in this sort of form, you can see Africa, only 3.3% of the world's primary energy consumption. So you can see the rate of potential growth there. In fact, about 1.3% is just South Africa. So there's a huge room for extra demand there. South and Central America, only 5.3%. And in fact, BP, who most of these statistics come from, in fact, they are the main sort of go-to resource, their statistical energy review, they predict that by 2040, we will still be about 81% reliant on fossil fuels, which is quite extraordinary and quite damning when you think about where we are with climate change and the fact that that just cannot happen in a sustainable world. So as you can see, I've taken a selection of emerging markets here just to look at what's happening with their demand growth for energy. Energy really is development, and it's absolutely necessary for them. It's something that we can't not allow them to have. You can see that they're all rising. I didn't put China on this graph because China is kind of off the scale, in fact. But the big hope at the moment is, as China slows down, is that India will take up where China's left off, and that will become the major market. And so that's the huge challenge that we face, just at the time that we need to be cutting our energy consumption globally, across the world. We all need to cut. We face a possible rise of about 35% by 2035 to 2040. That's the worrying scenario. And as you know, our global scientists are telling us that we need to peak global emissions no later than about 2020. And really, we need to fully decarbonise by about 2030 to have a 50-50 chance of staying under 2 degrees. Now, as you know, particularly those of you who were here last week, there's nothing safe about 2 degrees. 2 degrees really is a very dangerous level of global warming, and there'll be significant changes to our world, our human and physical geography at that stage. Of course, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, says that we are at the moment on the trajectory for probably the worst possible outcome, about a 6-degree warming by 2100. And of course, if anyone hasn't quite got the picture on that, that's not livable. We don't live at that level. That's beyond control. At 3 or 4 degrees, our society is completely changed. And the bad news is, of course, that we've really left this far, far too late to build our way out of it. It's not a question anymore of just substituting other technologies, other renewables for our fossil fuels. We've left it too late. The scale of the challenge is far too big. We actually need substantial cuts. In fact, really, scientists like Kevin Anderson are saying we need in our countries, in the OECD countries, a cut of about 10% per year for the next few years. And just really to emphasise, it is the next few years that are crucial now if we are to stay with under 2 degrees. If we just look at it in a different perspective, we look at it as per capita consumption, which perhaps is better than looking at it by country, you can see that in fact, you might feel rather smug there. The UK is quite light compared to many other countries. We consume about half per capita of what the US does and Canada does. But of course, actually, this comes with a very, very big health warning because as we have deindustrialised, so much of our manufacturing is done in other countries. And in fact, we import our energy. It doesn't show up on our energy bill. It comes in as embedded energy in the goods and the foodstuffs that we import. So unfortunately, we can't feel as smug as we'd quite like to. I think what's also quite interesting in that graph there is that you can see that most of the high consumers are the countries that are resource producers. They are high resource countries: Russia, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Canada, America. And actually this is a really good something that is a positive for us. Fossil fuels, well, positive in terms of changing. Fossil fuels are incredibly wasteful and expensive. This gives us another very, very good reason why we should get off them. And I've just got the figures here for 2012, so slightly out of date. You can increase them a little bit for what we're doing now. But if you think our primary energy consumption, so that's the stuff we get out of the ground and start using, is around 13.3 million tonnes of oil equivalent. But actually our final energy consumption, what we actually get to use, is far, far less. It's only about 9,000, less than 9,000. So we're wasting over 4,300. Now that's because we have to use so much energy to get fossil fuels to us. We have to drill them out, we have to process them, refine them, transport them, distribute them, and so on, burn them in the power stations and so on. So this is actually a very good, what that means, in fact, is, and I'm going to borrow some calculations here from Kevin Anderson, as climate scientist, that I really recommend everybody look up on YouTube. The reason I'm saying that this is a bit of a positive is that it makes fossil fuels slightly less difficult to challenge. If you think about using perhaps 10 units of energy in your A-rated fridge, effectively, to get that amount of energy out, of usable energy, you're putting in 50 units of energy. 54 if you include the transmission lines that get it to you. Obviously, we waste a huge amount at power stations, burning energy. Most of the energy goes up in heat, 120 units at a power station, and then he calculates it, I think, rather generously at 133 units when you think about the actual drilling costs and the transportation costs and so on. So this is obviously a very, very rough calculation, and it depends on which energy source you're looking at and where it's coming from. But if you think about it, for every 10 units of energy you save, you effectively save about 130 units out in the wider world. So this is you know, something perhaps that should give us some hope. It's worth making small changes at home because they have an outsized impact. So just to go back to kind of what the basic challenge is, just to see it rather graphically, effectively, if we are to decarbonise, which is what we have to do, we need to get coal, oil and natural gas into other. And if we don't want nuclear, we've got a huge, great challenge to go, as you can see. But without depressing you and making you feel like it's all undoable, we know that economic restructuring can come very, very fast. We've seen it in our very recent past. The unexpected rise of China started really taking off around 2003. No one saw it coming. You know, nobody, all our clever economists and manufacturers and businessmen and whatever didn't see it coming. And they had to reorientate their manufacturing and their marketing and so on very quickly. And we accommodated it. Perhaps a better example still is the banking crisis, where, you know, suddenly 2 hours from not being able to take money out of our cash machines, we managed to conjure up how many hundreds of billions across the world to save our banks. So, you know, it is possible. When in a crisis, you know, we are able to move fast, but we need to move fast now. We need to feel that there is a crisis, because there is. The good news is that you may be asking sort of, well, we're not really feeling it now. We don't have our smart meters. Where are the electric cars and so on? You know, but the good news is that this kind of technology, it's not a linear progression. It reaches a critical point. It follows an S-curve. It can, at a certain point, move very fast. We need it to move very fast. And of course, there's everything we can do to help that along its way, on its way. Energy demand growth is very, very low. Now this, at 1%, that may not sound particularly low to you when you look at the figure and see the graph going up and up and up. But that is actually despite the price drops. So when we've got fuel, we've got coal, oil and gas really at very rock bottom prices. Our economy should be zooming at the moment. We should be consuming masses of this stuff, but we're not. You know, the uptake hasn't been huge. In America, certainly they have started gas guzzling more, and I think last year we've started buying more SUVs, and we've started sort of clocking up more road miles and so on. But in fact, given how low our prices are at the moment, really our consumption is very low. So people are talking about a decoupling of economic growth from energy prices, which is quite a new thing. Really good news is, if it lasts, that global emissions appear to have flatlined for the last 2 years. We're still throwing out around 50 gigatons a year, but we don't appear to have increased that for the last 2 years. Perhaps too early to say that we've peaked, but it's certainly a very positive move. What we need to do now, of course, is cut very fast. There is, of course, massive investment in renewables in the Global South, to the point that, you know, the International Energy Agency saying this year, renewables are no longer a romantic dream. You know, this really is happening. This green revolution is happening. It's just a case of whether it happens fast enough. And as I say, a positive for those who are looking forward to a new low carbon world is that the fossil fuel industries are very energy intensive and have a number of problems with them, which I'll go into in a bit more detail next week. And in fact, actually, of course, surprisingly, our fossil fuel industries are in crisis at the moment. And this is just a selection, a fairly random selection of headlines from the Financial Times over the last couple of months. You know, at the moment, they don't really know where to go. Nobody knows kind of what's happening. We have interest rates at rock bottom, if not negative, we still can't get global demand up. The global trade is down. We're talking about peak trade, peak things, peak globalization, and so on. The air traffic, journeys are slowing down in demand. Our shipping companies are in dire straits, and so on. And so we've got a balance of power also tilting from fossil fuels to renewable energies. Oil demand growth to weaken next year. Gas, everyone assuming that China would be the next big market for gas, but it doesn't appear to be happening. Perhaps less good news for you and me, particularly if you have a pension invested in quite conventionally. You probably will have money invested in Shell and BP. Our energy companies are really suffering at the moment. Their profits are plunging. Most of them are borrowing to pay their dividends. And they're selling assets like mad. So we really do have fossil fuel industries in crisis at the moment. Statoil, I could have picked anyone. This is true for all our major oil companies. They are all cutting their capital expenditure by huge amounts, by billions and billions. We have a massive, massive withdrawal of investment at the moment across the world. And this, of course, is raising fears about future supplies. If we don't reduce demand, the likelihood is that within a few years we're going to have very high and very volatile prices. And that's a problem for us all. It's going to be a problem if they stay so volatile. It'll be a problem for the oil companies and the coal companies and so on themselves, the gas companies themselves, because they need stable prices to invest. And it's very likely that we will become more reliant on the Middle East. If with this withdrawal of investment at the moment from particularly non-OPEC sources of oil and gas, we're likely to become more reliant on the Middle East with all the political implications that has. Just interesting to note also that the part of the, and we'll talk about this more next week, the crisis in the oil and gas industry isn't just down to pricing. The oil and gas industries have not handled themselves well. They've overspent when they shouldn't have. When prices were high, they didn't see the drop coming, and they have not kept control of their own capital expenditure. So they have been paying far over the odds, thinking that the days of high prices were going to stay. And now we have whopping great companies going bankrupt. Rio Tinto, not bankrupt, but selling a coal mine for less than a cup of coffee, $1 Australian. So, we have a mass shedding of assets at the moment. And there you are, you can see, this is just for oil and gas, I think. But you can see the really big cuts in investment, and that is really going to have a knock-on effect in the next few years for all of us, unless we cut demand, of course. So just to run through, I thought it might be useful just to run through some of our basic fuel sources and just kind of get a picture of where they are. I will go into, this is a very, very broad overview. So next week when we talk about the oil and gas industries, I will go into more detail, and obviously in the talk about nuclear, I will go into more detail on that. But I think this one, perhaps for us, is still quite a bit of a shock that coal is still so dominant. It's 42% of the world's electricity, about 29% of primary fuel, because we don't use it much. And of course, actually, one thing our government has done is start the closure of our coal-fired power stations. Most of them are offline during the summer at the moment, or on very, very basic level. And should all be closed by 2025 is the plan in our country. But it's still obviously a massive contributor to the world's fuel out there. So you can see where the demand has come in the last few years. It's come mainly from Asia. Coal consumption has increased. That's not just China, that's also India and also Indonesia. Production also from Australia. So that all comes into that Asian section. But finally, a falling off last year, which was it was very welcome, but we need to see a massive cut in coal, because coal is the fuel source that is so dirty, even the oil and gas industry are pointing a finger at it and saying this has to go. It's the one they're sort of throwing under a bus and saying, hey, even we are cleaner than coal. Okay, so but the trouble is, even rich countries are still using it. We're all having trouble getting off coal. The US in particular, and Germany. I mean, Germany has about 44% of its electricity. We think of Germany as being a very, very green country, leading in the renewable field, but it's actually burning the worst kind of coal, the really low-grade brown lignite coal, for most of its electricity, or for at least almost half of its electricity. The US is cutting under Obama's Clean Power Plan, but not fast enough. You can see from the next slide that it's still a major consumer, 10%. China, in fact, has come down from about 56%. But yes, we are still, I think Poland is actually still about 90% of its electricity comes from coal. So it's a major issue. We're still consuming it, we're still producing it. And the problem is that it is about 28% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which is extraordinary when you think about it. These pictures are from Vietnam, India and China. And it's obviously a major contributor to the pollution problems in those countries. And when you think about that gas, that coal mine that I showed in the first slide on coal, you can imagine the methane that's seeping out from that, from an open cast mine. And remember, methane is about 25 times more powerful and more destructive than CO2. It also combines with smog to form ground level ozone, so it forms another kind of greenhouse gas. And the cost of the air pollution itself is extremely high. There's a recent report come out which says it's about $5 trillion a year, $5 trillion, and contributes about 5.5 million deaths per year. So coal really is the one that we are all focused on, that we need to get rid of. And the good news is that it is starting to decline, but we obviously need it to go much faster. The coal price has slumped from about $80 to $40 in just a few years, and that means that the coal industry really, really is in crisis. This is one of the biggest companies in the world, in fact, but certainly one of the biggest energy producers, Peabody. And look at this, from 2011 or so till now, their shares have slumped by about 98%. They've now just gone into bankruptcy. Arch Coal, another one in the US, has done exactly the same. There really is this, they've been undercut by gas, but they are companies that are really, really in trouble. And so you might ask, why is that? Why is the coal industry in particular in such crisis? And really it goes back to the very, very basic economics of a commodity cycle. And this is something that we're very used to. I could write this story for oil or gas or as well as coal. But basically when demand takes off, as it did in the early 2000s when China started to seriously industrialise, there was a sort of surge of demand, and that began to push up prices. And what that did was draw in a huge number of investors. The companies themselves started to invest in more and more assets, but it also brought in all our commodity speculators, all the paper traders, as they're called, moving around in derivatives. And so there was all this money flowing into commodities. In fact, your pensions, probably before the early 2000s, were mainly invested in equities, in shares. But really, the financial world discovered commodities in the early 2000s, and they piled into commodities and enlarged it. The amount that went in was hundreds of billions of dollars, new dollars. So it made it a very, what we call, liquid market. But so that encouraged companies to massively overinvest in very expensive projects. They didn't keep control of their capital expenditure. And then, but the normal cycle of the business cycle is that as high commodity prices rise, it encourages too much production, so you get a glut, and it also encourages the use of the production of alternatives. And so eventually, of course, the price turns and starts to go down, which is where we are now, and we're pretty much at the bottom of the cycle for oil, gas and coal. And so you might say, well, are we just waiting for the wheel to turn, as an industry usually would, and wait for demand to pick up again, because prices are now very low, so normally that would happen. But the point is, this time we're looking at whether there is a real change in demand, a real structural change, partly because of government regulation and partly because of renewables. So there's quite a lot going on. This is just one very concrete example, which is very well known to many environmentalists because it's so awful in many ways. The Adani company is an Indian company, and they've invested 16 billion in 9 new mines in Queensland. And the really part of the worrying scenarios that they are going to enlarge Abbott's Point, which is a port in the middle of the Barrier Reef. So there's the potential for massive, massive destruction there. And they've done this, they've made this huge investment based on the fact that China would be their market. But in fact, China now is almost not, has said no. They're developing their own sources, they're finding energy from other sources. And so Adani has had to switch to India and hope that India will take their coal. But of course, India itself has massive coal resources, and Modi is very keen, Premier Modi in India is very keen to develop India's resources before importing. So it's, what I'm saying is, this project has been opposed by environmentalists who've done a fantastic job of getting banks to divest. So HSBC and Deutsche Bank have had to pull out, said no, they won't contribute. The courts have been used to impose all sorts of blocks on the project and slow it down. But really the biggest threat, and I think this is something that everybody needs to understand, the really big threat is economics. Is there a market for it? Is there, because none of these projects will go ahead. These projects that we really do not want, which the world cannot afford in terms of the environment and climate change, cannot afford to have developed. And that it's really, how do we change the economics? That is the question, because that is how they will be defeated in the end. So with all that, so although coal is in crisis and companies going bust all over the place, it's likely to prove very resilient. 7,000 million tonnes still mined annually with all the methane leakage and so on that brings. The reason that coal is very still so popular is that its reserves are quite evenly distributed around the world. It's not concentrated in the Middle East or any particularly politically sensitive source. It's easy to transport. You dig it up, you stick it on a train, off it goes, you stick it on a ship. And it's cheap fuel for the global south. And of course, many coal companies would make the point that we cannot deny poorer countries this access to this very, very cheap fuel source. Morally, we don't have the right when we're, really very, very wasteful with our own consumption. Of course, we also use coal to produce steel, which is a major product for everything in the world, for development and building in the world. And so the worrying scenario is that there are between 1,200 and 1,400 new coal-fired power plants planned around the world, which includes many in the EU. That's pretty awful, particularly when you think that, there are many studies, but this latest one says that we cannot, but according to whether we want to stay under 2 degrees, we certainly can't afford to build any new coal after 2017, just for a 50% chance, 50-50 chance of staying under 2 degrees. So we have to get rid of coal somehow or other. On to oil. Okay, so we all know oil is what we use. It's almost a non-substitutable energy source. We use it for transport. And at the moment, we haven't really got ourselves geared up to use anything else. We need it for planes, we need it for ships, we need it for cars, okay? And although we're moving towards electric cars and we're moving towards hydrogen possibly hydrogen in some vehicles, we really are very, very dependent on oil. And of course, oil doesn't just come from the sort of conventional rigs these days. This is tar sands in Canada. This is the boreal forest that we're so dependent upon as a carbon sink. absolutely decimated. This is huge, huge acreages in Alberta. And these are the wells in, this one is particularly is Monterey in California. This is shale, so this is shale tight oil that's been fracked and got out in this way. And of course America has become a major oil producer, which we'll talk about again more next week, sorry. In fact, shale has been the major disruptor in the energy markets. You know, we really thought that we were heading towards peak oil, and anybody will remember, you know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, we were referring to the fact that there just wouldn't be enough. But with the price so high, many explorers went back and started looking at the old oil fields dotted around the US and started trying to see with new technologies, actually not so new, but they were putting them together, horizontal drilling and fracturing, put them together and see whether they could get stuff out. And what they were coming up with mainly was gas, but then they moved on, as the gas price went down, they moved on to wet wells and started producing more and more oil. So at the moment, the point is nobody knows kind of what is going to happen here. This has really upset the whole global energy market. You can see here, this prediction was made in 2011 that tight oil would take off. In fact, I think the US is way over 12 million barrels a day now. And that it would start dropping down about 2020, and that's what we expected to happen. But then it was also expected that the oil price would stay, even on the worst case scenario, above $100. And it's much, much lower than that now. Of course, it's sort of $40 to $50. So in fact, we're seeing almost immediately a drop off in shale production now. But the industry is proving very, very adaptable, very, very resilient, and it's not dropping off as quickly as we thought. The technology is moving on very fast. Almost nobody can predict where this is going at the moment. But here we are. The US has become the biggest oil producer. This is in million barrels, so 12.7 million barrels. Saudi Arabia second, and the Russian Federation at over 10. So those are our major oil producers in the world. The UK I've put in there just for fun, but in fact, actually, that figure will be out of date because the North Sea has obviously really crashed this year. We've had a massive withdrawal of rigs and so on. So there we go. Oil reserves are what matters most to oil companies, but of course it matters to us when it comes to making predictions. At the moment, it looks like we have about 50 years of oil left, but that's actually not a lot. So peak oil hasn't really gone away. Peak oil moves depending on whether the oil is accessible with technology and at a certain price. One of the interesting things is, I mean, I think this chart is a bit of a joke, really. I mean, that top one up there is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, certainly for the last, God knows how many years, I mean, decades, has been pumping around 10 million barrels a day. But the strange thing is its reserves go up every year. It's extraordinary. Of course, because it's a closed economy and because it's a national oil company, it's not listed on a stock exchange. It doesn't have to have its reserves verified. And that's true of all the national oil companies. So it's a little bit of a quandary, and that's something that we'll talk about next week because that has a big impact on pricing, the role of Saudi Arabia, the role of OPEC, and so on. Does anyone know why we've got some sudden jumps here for Canada and Venezuela? Has anyone got any good ideas? Tar sands, yes, yeah. Up until about 2008, they weren't allowed to book them. Tar sands obviously is a very different industry. It's a mining industry rather than an extractive industry. But eventually we did allow Canada to book their reserves, and so they've got a sort of massive jump. Venezuela as well. Venezuela now technically the highest, second highest reserves in the world, in the Orinoco Belt. Venezuela, of course, has a famine on at the moment. It's quite extraordinary. People are hungry in Venezuela. It's an absolute disaster, but there we go. So in terms of our oil, just to give you the picture, so our oil is increasing. We are at about 94 million barrels a day consumption, okay, which is really quite enormous, and we're heading towards 100 million barrels a day at the rate we're going. And of course, China there in particular, and India, the Asian economies have been the big increase in consumption. And you can see there, in fact, how the lift there in North America at the bottom there, since about 2010, and the lift in production. And again, that is what's having quite a big impact on prices at the moment. And so we've had this 50-year roller coaster of oil pricing, and it really is, if anyone needed another good reason to get off fossil fuels and to get off oil in particular, it's a really good reason. This dictates so much of our economy. We tend not to feel it, but in fact this is the sort of background. This determines the prices you pay for so much in the stores, because so much has to be transported around the world, and it is such an unstable price. Brent is the leading benchmark, and we'll talk about this more next week. But if you think, this is one of the quite extraordinary things. So what we've had here is quite a lot of volatility. This is just easing into the 2006 to 2016, and you can see that period for a few years where it was stable over $100, and that's what caused the massive overinvestment in some very, very high cost production: shale, Arctic, very deep water off Brazil, and so on, and tar sands, of course. But now the price has absolutely dropped, and the price has dropped with only about a 2% change in supply. So it's completely out of kilter. The drop in price of about $70 from a 2% change in supply, it's really, really out of line. And again, we'll talk about this next week, because most people think that oil prices are determined purely by supply and demand. In fact, there are an awful lot of other complicating factors in there. So in terms of oil, what are the prospects? It is one we absolutely need to cut. If we're going to stay within our 2 degrees, we have to stop using oil. And the problem is that we are still very, very dependent upon it for our transport in particular. Ships, planes and cars. Ships, of course, about a third of shipping is actually moving oil around the world. So that's, so when we cut down on our oil consumption, we actually immediately cut down on our shipping. We have, of course, had the first solar flight around the world, but it's not going to be big enough to take you or me to Australia. And of course, electric cars, everything's moving. All the manufacturers are moving in there, but they're not. But we're not really seeing it on the streets at the moment. So the situation with oil is that at the moment we're in a bit of a lull. We've got low prices, but we shouldn't expect that to last. Nobody really knows where this is going to go. That is why the industry is really at a crux, at a real confused point. And really, transport is the key. So it's up to us really to do what we can to bring down demand. Gas is our other third major fossil fuel, usually associated with oil. Usually when you get an oil field, there's usually a cap of gas on top under the rock. And what we've never been, for a long time, we didn't know what to do with gas. We just simply, it was too difficult to transport. You can't just shove gas in a barrel like you can oil and stick it on a ship or a train or whatever else. So it was just too difficult. So generally we were just either venting it up into the air, that's pure methane, pretty disastrous, or we flared it. And that has been also pretty disastrous. We're still flaring, and of course the industry thinks that they will continue to flare until about 2030 at the very best. So it's an absolutely a tragic waste of fuel, but when it's so far from a market, sometimes it's just not economic to do anything with it. Having said that, the big change in the gas industry has been the development of liquefied natural gas. And this is the technology and the finances came together to enable us to supercool gas to a minus 162 degrees, stick it on a special ship under pressure and ship it across the ocean. And in fact, this morning, who heard the news that we've got our first load of shale gas in from the US? And that will have been cooled to minus 162, put in a special cryogenic vessel, shipped across to us, where we will warm it and regasify it, and then put it into our distribution network. We're getting gas from various other sources these days, from shale gas, from coal bed methane. So we're fracturing down, we're in a similar way to fracking, down into our coal beds to get methane out. And of course the methane hydrates that we discussed last week, which are all around our continents and becoming increasingly unstable, but these are becoming more and more seen as a fuel source for us. But remember, methane 25 times more dangerous than CO2. And every time you try and drill for gas or you try and transport it, you lose it, you leak it. And that is really absolutely dangerous for our climate. So just as the LNG market and the technology was moving ahead, and companies were investing. They were obviously it's a huge commitment to invest in the facilities to cool the gas, and then at the other end to warm it and regasify it. But what happened? Shale gas came along, and it sort of crashed the market. Suddenly, we had a gas glut, which we still have, and the price just crashed. So we now have the situation where we have a massive glut of LNG and a massive glut of gas generally around the world, and very, very low prices. This is the biggest LNG plant in the world. This is in Qatar. Since 2006, it's taken off and, of course, made every Qatari among the richest people in the world. They have the highest per capita income, I think. And this is an LNG vessel, so you'll see this coming to places like Haverfordwest and unloading their gas. But the gas price has absolutely tanked, down to about $2, and that has meant, again, that we've got a massive withdrawal of investment from gas. And it's really unclear when the backlog, when the glut is going to be cleared. It's proving very resilient at the moment. So even though we've had this massive withdrawal of investment, particularly in the US, you can see most production hasn't changed that much since last year. And here we are, that's in gas production now. US is also leading in gas production. UK very, very small. In fact, for 2016, again, will be much less. Russia, of course, big one, supplies most of Europe. We get most of our gas, in fact, now from Norway. And from Qatar, in fact. And of course, the risk for the gas industry is that other countries will develop their shale. So there's great potential around the world. And this map actually doesn't show Russian shale, which is enormous. Argentina has been trying to develop theirs. Poland, companies went in a few years ago, all gung-ho, hoping to get a lot of gas out of Poland. In fact, the geology defeated them, the geology and the economics, and they've all pretty much pulled out. China, of course, is the one that everybody's been thinking, wow, what if China starts developing its own shale gas? It's not going to want to import from anybody anywhere else, and it'll be an exporter, for God's sake. So it will really upset the market. But in fact, China's shale has also proved very, very difficult to exploit. And Shell and I think Chevron have pulled out of China now. BP has gone in to China to see if they can exploit it. But these wells can take millions, something like 23, each well, about 23 million litres of water. And if you're, as it is in China, the shale is in pretty arid regions, you're very unlikely to be able to get that gas out. So although, I think that offers some hope for the UK as well. Although we may have technically huge resources, it is really unclear that they are exploitable and that they are going to be commercially viable. Of course, the companies are saying, just give us a chance and we'll find out, but it is really not clear. And by the way, if anyone heard any of the interviews this morning, and INEOS saying that it how can it be that it is cheaper to import gas, shale gas from the US as LNG than it is to use our own gas? It's not because that gas is actually so cheap to produce, it's just that there is a glut of it. It's not economically viable, really, to import that. It's just that there's such an oversupply at the moment, they don't know what else to do with it. They're grateful for a market. So, but this could really upset things further if any country does seriously go ahead and develop more shale. And remember, for us, our major gas consumption is not just in our electricity production, but it's actually our heating. And we, of course, are still, I mean, every housing development we build, we still build each one with a little gas boiler. We are still building ourselves into a dependency on gas for a lot longer to come. And this is the way it's being sold to us, that gas is clean. Compared to coal, it is at the power plant, but it's not a clean technology. If you take in what we call the full life cycle analysis of getting the gas out of the ground, processing it and transporting it and distributing it with all those methane leaks, it is not a clean technology. But you will hear, I have heard, you know, government officials and so on saying that this is a clean tech. It's not. What the industry is doing is developing much more efficient turbines, but they can never be more than about 50% efficient. We're always going to lose huge amounts at the power station. Each power station will just go up in heat. That's the laws of thermodynamics. But unfortunately, if you want to get rid of coal, as we do, and nuclear, as we do, most scenarios say that we are likely to be dependent on gas for a lot longer. Of course, one of our major questions for us in the future is what we do about our heating, whether we electrify it or whether we use hydrogen. And of course, another contender against gas, but it can never produce enough to displace natural gas, is biomethane, which we get from anaerobic digestion. But it's very unlikely. I mean, in Bristol, we have the great example of our poo buses and so on. But we're very unlikely to be able to displace or make a serious dent into our gas consumption, natural gas consumption. Nuclear, I'll just run through this quickly. At the moment, I mean, over the last few years, of course, our nuclear energy consumption has been fairly stable across the world. Private companies haven't wanted to invest more in this in the last few years because it's turned out to be actually an incredibly expensive technology, and we still have not sorted out what to do about waste disposal. And if anybody saw Panorama a few weeks ago, you'll know what a serious issue that is. But of course, with worries about climate change, people are now looking at this as a relatively clean technology, and lo and behold, we have an enormous number planned, 67 under construction, 155 planned and 322 proposed. And some of those are in parts of the world where most of us would think we wouldn't really want nuclear technology to be, particularly when you read about, you know, the theft of nuclear materials in Iraq and whatever. You know, it's just really, do humans, I mean, this is my fear, are we mature enough to deal with nuclear technology? I think everything, our last 60 years of history shows that we're not. We still haven't found a way of disposing of it. We're still happily producing more, and we're going to leave that for our future generations. It's a very practical and a very moral issue, I think. And of course, I'll discuss this more in the talk specifically about nuclear, but this is Flamanville, France. This is the prototype for Hinkley. It's been an utter disaster in France, of course. This was supposed to be online in 2012, still not there. Unlikely to be ready before 2019 at the earliest, failed its safety tests last year, 3 or 4 times over budget already. Just a disaster, but of course that is what we are in line for at Hinkley. And of course, so renewable energy has come on leaps and bounds, and this is the big hope here. BP, for whatever their reason, they separate this off from hydro power. I think I suspect they do that to minimise the impact of renewables, because as they claim, renewables are still only contributing around 3% of the world's primary fuel. So that is a very, very small amount. But when you add it to hydro, it's a little bit more. But you can see massive growth, and there's Europe up there on the top one. We're doing very, very well. But if we are to the challenges we face really are, it's not just about power production. You know, when I hear people talk about renewables, they talk purely about our electricity and displacing other fuels from our electricity supply. But we also have to displace gas from our heating and cooking, and oil from our transport. And those are much, much bigger mountains to climb. Our power consumption in this country, electricity, is only about 20% of our primary fuel. So, or our final fuel, should I say. So renewables, we're doing very, very well. The question is, well, the trouble is that we're left in this, because we did not get going in the 1990s or the early 2000s, we are left with this awful dilemma at the moment, which is, and I have this much sympathy for our governments, okay, because the technology, we have renewable technology, but without the demand management and the battery storage, you know, to them it looks like a very untested, insecure fuel source, and who wants to be a government when the lights go out? So they're plumping for the conventional fuels and just hoping that climate change is somehow or other going to go away, and it's not going to be on their watch. But of course, it's a more imminent problem than we haven't got time to mess around with this. So, and just, this is the awful truth, of course, just renewables themselves, no one should think that renewables are completely carbon free. This is Bautu in Mongolia, which produces a lot of rare earths, which some of them are used in magnets in wind turbines and in electric cars and so on. It's an absolute devastation, of course. So, I mean, I don't think anyone should think that renewables themselves don't come with their own issues. There is such a thing as the 2015 Solar Scorecard, and it is kind of alarming how many companies don't score very high, many of them actually below 15 out of 100. And they're assessed on things like recycling and use of child labour, toxic chemicals and so on. So, you know, I hate to put a downer on it, but, you know, nobody should think that it is clean, it's much better than the alternatives, but it still involves some industrial processes. Biofuels, of course, are a potential challenge to our oil, but they've fallen out of favour because of the whole land use issue, because of the problem of growing enough crops to produce the biofuels that we need to make a serious dent on our oil consumption. And of course, if you have to use fertilisers and pesticides on those crops, then in fact it really isn't a very green solution at all. So biofuels have sort of gone out of favour, and particularly it was the issue about land use and displacing it from food production when we need that food for the world. Okay, so there is, as I say, the IEA, everybody is saying renewables are here. The question is whether they move fast enough. They bring us so tantalisingly close to all our goals. And they bring us to a very, very different world, a really different world where we're not dependent on oil prices and commodity markets and foreign exchange markets in the same way that we are now. They give us energy sovereignty. Think of the impact on our foreign policy once we are not looking to source fuels from the many countries that we have to go to now. But we have to deal with the variability, there are challenges for our grids, and we have to find new ways to finance them. Renewables generally, they are not enough on their own. We need the energy storage and the demand management, and that's where the bit that we're lagging in now. It's moving very fast, the technology and the investment is moving very fast, but we are in a slight sort of hiatus now, considering how much investment has to go forward into future energy And that's why our governments are kind of not making the right decisions in many cases. Here's the Tesla battery factory in the Nevada desert. I mean, there are wonderful advancements being made in battery technology, and Tesla is obviously at the forefront of that. So there's every hope that we're going to get there, but the question is whether we get there in time. And the bottom line is, let's to summarise what we've looked at. The coal, oil and gas industries are all in crisis. They don't know where to go. Nobody knows where to go at the moment. Nobody knows where to invest. It is not clear. Well, they have to make humongous investments, and they are looking usually at a 10, 20, 30-year timeline. They can't see that far ahead at the moment. And there's this absolute dithering while we have gluts, as demand is also questionable. Demand is not zooming up at the rate that it has, and nobody can tell whether this is a normal cycle or whether this is something that really structurally changing. Renewables and efficiency are essential, but they're not enough. We need to find better ways of making effective use of them, and effectively we need cuts. There's only one way around it. We in the West who waste so much energy need to stop wasting it. That is the absolute bottom line here. We need a radical reduction in demand. 10% per year is what climate scientists are telling us. Okay, and just in case anybody was under any doubt, we are the sort of world's elite in terms of consumers. And we produce most of us qualify as in the top 1% of the world's population, and we produce about 50% of the world's emissions. So there we are. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, cut our path dependency, and that means, we can't have this shilly-shallying around. No more runways. We can't start building new coal, gas, power plants, and so on. Really, we need to be on a war footing looking at full-on investment in new clean technology. If anybody's wondering what this is the flying bum. This is one of the industry's answers to aviation and making it more efficient. Apparently flying in one of those is much more efficient than a conventional airplane. So I just thought I'd add that in, just in case anybody hadn't seen it. Does it? Yeah, a bomb crashing from the sky is not a good thought, is it? But I just think, I just suppose I want to end on a really positive note. We have a massive, massive challenge ahead. There is no doubt. And really, the challenge is in the next few years. And I can't say it often enough. Our power plants across the developed world, our industrialised world, are all in need of changing. Most of them are ready to come offline. The question is, what do we replace them with? And if we look at the clean technology which brings us energy sovereignty, I just want you to think about the different world that could have, particularly on our foreign policy and particularly on international development. We have lived with a global south, the horrors of a global south, for all our lifetimes, and so much more. Really, energy is development. Renewables really bring energy sovereignty to many developing countries, and that's a real prize to think on. So there we are. I'm doing this for Solar Aid. So my little contribution to putting some solar power into Africa. But thank you very much.